computer. All right, hopefully everyone heard that the recording is in progress. So if you are not happy with your wardrobe choice or anything like that, you can turn off your video and avoid having that repeated on social media for the next year. But regardless, thank you everyone for coming. I really appreciate you taking time out of your Tuesday afternoon, evening to come in and hear about what I consider to be a pretty exciting new project that is launching this year with an incredible group of partners. And so here is the agenda for today. I'm going over the welcome right now. We'll do just some very basic ground rules. Then I'll give a little bit of a background on the region and the flooding, and then we'll get into the specific projects with each of the individuals here, and then just throw it open to questions you may have or any discussion you want to have. So ground rules, I think we probably all know this at this point after 2 years of Zoom life and Microsoft meetings, but make sure you're muted. And that isn't that we don't want to hear from you, but just to avoid background noise when people are speaking. You can, if you see at the bottom of Zoom, there's a chat feature. If you have questions, we're going to wait to the end to do the questions. So as they come into your head, feel free to type them in, and then we'll just go from the top and scroll down, answering those as we can. And then of course, I don't think we're going to have this as being an issue, but always be respectful of people's times and opinions. And finally, if there's something you want to ask or have a little bit more of a dialogue with, feel free to raise your hands or what have you, and then we can call on you and unmute and speak that way. But with that, this is the project planning team. Many of these folks are on the call today. You'll be hearing from them later. I want to put this up more than anything just to demonstrate the diversity of experience and expertise that this group has. It's a pretty unique group for folks I've worked with in Hawaii, in that you've got everyone from nonprofits to governments to engineers to conservationists all working together on addressing the flooding and pollution issue in the Maunalua Bay region. So it's a pretty exciting group of very knowledgeable individuals that are helping with this. And I'm looking forward to seeing some of the proposals and projects that come from it. To give just a brief background, I don't know if I mentioned, my name is Doug Harper. I'm the executive director for Mālama Maunalua. We were created about 15 years ago because a hui of longtime residents around Maunalua Bay saw that the bay had degraded from what they remembered as kids, and there was not an organization focused on restoring it. So they created Mālama Maunalua with the express goal of basically halting that degradation and returning Maunalua Bay to a healthy and productive ecosystem through the use of community kuleana. And Maunalua Bay, of course, is in the area. In the yellow box, here's a little bit more of a zoomed in area, zoomed in look of it. It's one of the largest bays in the state. And those 3 watersheds you see in the middle, there's 10 total for Maunalua Bay, but Wailupe, Niu, and Kuli'o'o are the watersheds that we're going to be focusing on for this project. For Maunalua Bay as a whole, if you look back into certainly pre-contact and even pre-20th century, it was seen as a bread basket for Oahu for sure. We have Quapa Fish Pond, which is one of the largest fish ponds in all of Polynesia, certainly the largest in Hawaii. It was able to feed over 1 million Hawaiians on the island of Oahu. When you look back at some of the fishing rules from days in the past, you see a lot of limits that there's no way we could catch that many now. And you see species there that you don't really see anymore. And to tie some of that connection between the Mauka and the Makai, the horse you see there is actually drinking fresh water. There's that much of a freshwater connection between Maunalua Bay and what is taking place Mauka, which is why an organization like Mālama Maunalua that is focused on restoring the health of Maunalua Bay is concerned and interested in what is taking place on the land. Around the 1940s, you saw significant development taking place. Basically, Honolulu itself started creeping eastward. You saw first Wailupe being developed, Niu on down to Hawaii Kai. You had the Quapa Fish Pond that I mentioned was dredged. and basically the productivity killed that way. You have now 50,000 people that have moved here. You have 10 shopping centers that are in the area. You have a significant increase in invasive species. Impervious surface for the coastal strip is over 90%. And so if you aren't familiar with what that term is, it's one you'll probably hear quite a bit today. Impervious surface is basically land that's been developed that can no longer, water can no longer penetrate. So things like roofs, parking lots, streets, all of that. And basically what happens is when the water falls on the land, it then runs off the land, which brings with it all of the pollution that it picks up, increases flood volume. All of, compounding this problem is the fact that all of the streams have been channelized and all but Wailupe have been cemented. So when the water gets into the streams, it is just basically shooting straight out to Maunalua Bay. Looking at kind of an indicative watershed Wailupe, 43% of Wailupe watershed is impervious surface. So going back to it, 43% is now concrete or no longer capable of having water penetrate in those areas. It is actually the only unlined stream in the region, which makes it unique for the region, but also makes it somewhat of an exciting engineering opportunity to reduce some of the flooding taking place. The forest is 85% invasive species. And I know JC will get into this a little bit later, but part of why that is important is not only do you want to protect and preserve native species as much as you can, but invasive species aren't as adapted or evolved to Hawaii's climatic patterns. So as we have droughts, for instance, you'll have invasive species dying, exposing the soil. And so when it rains, you increase sedimentation and runoff coming from the land. And we have a fairly significant ungulate problem, which for Maunalua Bay is primarily pigs. That's twofold problematic. One part is you have them compacting the soil, which increases runoff, and the other part is they root up vegetation, which again increases erosion and sedimentation coming down into the bay. So this is the municipal storm system, the solution we have come up with, meaning people living in the area and the city and state, to addressing all of these new runoff and pollution issues. This is all, when it rains, it goes into these storm sewer systems and it pumps straight out to the bay unfiltered. And so all of that pollution and stuff that's picking up is coming to the bay, bringing with it sedimentation and polluted runoff. So you have, as you may see after storms, brown water advisories and recommendations to not get in the water. And it's because of the way we've constructed the region that you are seeing significant problems after rainstorms. And we're noticing that as well in the water quality studies that have been conducted. You see in the upper left, Enterococcus, which is fecal matter. Kuli'o'o stream is some of the highest in the state. The blue bars, you don't have to lean in too close to your computer. The blue bars are post-storm, and Kuli'o'o stream sees some of the highest Enterococcus marks in the state, which is obviously detrimental not only to ecological health, but also to human health. And then in 2019, I believe it was probably the largest water quality study in state history was conducted in Maunalua Bay. There's a whole bunch of findings from this, but a couple to take note of. Over 99% of the samples that were taken found glyphosate, which is an herbicide. So that means that all of those herbicides that people are putting on their land are running off, coming out to the bay, impacting ecological health. Significant turbidity, you can see that in the lower left, which is basically sedimentation and pollution in the water. And then ibuprofen was found in 21%. This is significant for the simple fact that people ingest these different drugs, evacuate it, and then it's finding its way into the water system. So when you're going down there and swimming, you're swimming with whatever people have ingested throughout the bay, and that's not, or throughout the region, which obviously is not good for human health, and it's also not good for ecosystem and marine species health either. There's been a lot of work and studies that have been looked at for how you address flooding in the region. I put these up. This is by no means all of them, but I put this up just to indicate that this isn't the first time this has been done. We're taking a little bit of a unique path towards it. and we will be looking at what has been done in the past. So our project, Watershed Planning Project, is funded by the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. The way they do it is they kind of fund different phases of the planning process. This is the planning phase. So it's the very beginning when we're just kind of surveying what's going on and coming up with potential solutions for how we can address these issues. You can see the partners there. I mentioned them earlier. I mentioned also the locations, but also another component of this is making sure that as we come up with these solutions, we're doing so with an eye towards climate change. So groups that are coming down, a generation from now don't have to keep re-looking at this problem, because hopefully the solutions we can come up with this time are not only going to be beneficial to the region now, but they'll be beneficial to future generations. And I believe with that, I apologize for a very quick, very fast spoken rip through the history of the area and kind of how this project came about. But now the important part of getting into the experts talk about how they and what they are addressing. So first up, JC.
Right on. Thanks, Doug. Great synopsis of all the things and the moving parts and really what's affecting the bay. Yeah, so I'm going to be focusing my brief segment on ungulate removal and fencing. So, Doug mentioned the primary, ungulate of concern in the Maunalua Bay region is feral pigs. They do have, well, I'll get into that in the next slide. I'll just talk a little bit more about kind of the pre-planning stage. So, ungulate removal is kind of the first step to forest restoration, right? You got to protect before you start to restore, because these pigs can get in and really undo any of the efforts that you put in the ground. And we're going to be focusing on Pia Valley, where Tyrone and Protect and Preserve Hawaii have been doing a lot of native forest restoration currently, and putting, thousands and thousands of native trees back into the ground, and essentially, starting the transition process of this degraded landscape back into a biodiverse, kind of a biodiverse green infrastructure project. Currently, the lower portions of the valley are about 90% dominated by invasive species. Two in particular, haulekoa and guinea grass. These two culprits are really prevalent in our dry forest ecosystems as kind of a byproduct of the ranching era, when there was, cows in the back of New Valley for like a couple hundred years. So then when the cattle got pulled out, all that filled in was the pasture grasses that were introduced and the woody fodder that was introduced as well. So yeah, we've been transitioning that into a more biologically diverse system, which of course slows the rainwater down, locks in that sediment, and kind of acts as a green filter. You can go to the next slide if you want. Yeah, so the part of what we're doing with our project is focusing really on the ungulate issue. And in short, we're planning a watershed protection fence. The Ko'olau Mountains Watershed Partnership and the state of Hawaii, we have a number of these fences throughout the Ko'olau. The majority of them are in the northern central region, where the majority of our rainfall and aquifer recharge occur. This will be the first kind of to landscape scale fence in East Honolulu. There is a small, like 5-acre fence in Wailupe Valley that protects habitat for the Oahu elapaio, one of our endangered flycatchers. But yeah, this fence would be protecting. We're looking at kind of the whole valley holistically. It'll be broken in ideally into 2 units. We've started scoping on the lower parcel, so it's about 300 acres that abuts the community, and we're looking kind of tentatively at a like a horseshoe shaped fence, and this would then be kind of paired with ungulate removal efforts once the fence is complete. Pig density in this lower elevation region is actually pretty low. There's really not a lot of what I would consider prime habitat for the feral ungulates. It's more of a transitory population that moves up and down and across the valleys based on food and water availability. So in dry times, unfortunately, in dry times like right now in the tail end of winter, the majority of the pigs have moved up up farther into the valleys where there's more water available. But then with the guava fruiting and stuff, they move down and they can come into the communities. So essentially, yeah, by removing ungulates, this results in less disturbance, which is a reduced sedimentation, reduced nutrient load because pigs deposit nutrients directly into the stream corridors, either through fecal contamination or carcass. They also, by removing pigs, you have a reduced movement of invasive species as they're the primary mover of species like strawberry guava. And then when you have that kind of cycle of destruction stop, you have better vegetative recovery through natural grow back, or if you do supplementary native plantings, you even have better cover that way. And then you have increased watershed recharge and decreased runoff. And then, like I mentioned earlier, you have this increased restoration effectiveness, which is pretty important because you're no longer doing this 2 steps forward, 1 step back, or 2 steps forward, 3 step back process where every plant you put in the ground, a pig comes by the next day and rips it out. So you have this increase in restoration effectiveness. And then, of course, higher biodiversity, especially if you're working with natives, just helps to have a more robust and resilient ecosystem. And yeah, this is pretty exciting. I think this would be, it is essentially when the pigs are removed, you're going to have a lot less disturbance in this lower parcel, and it'll essentially act as a big green filter for any runoff coming from the upper watersheds coming through. Yeah, I'm excited.
Great. Thanks, JC. Moving on down to JB.
Okay, good evening and aloha. Can you all see me okay? Video on. Doug, can you guys see? Can you hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you.
Great, okay. So good evening, everyone. I want to talk about the next part of our cooperative project, which is something called surface water flow path mapping. And this is a technique that's used basically to let everyone from engineers and designers to folks who are really not experts at all picture where and how much water is flowing through their neighborhoods and where different strategies at different scales can make a difference in water quality and also in addressing flooding. Different strategies need to be put in different places based on how much water is flowing through. And this is a really fairly simple technique that we're going to be doing in the watershed to really help everyone picture this and think about strategies. So I'm Birchline Planning, LLC. That's the firm of me, myself, and I. And the engineering will be done by my wonderful colleague, Sarah Runger at Hay & Associates. We work together a lot on this. So on the next slide, flow path mapping is a technique using elevation data, building footprints, which are actually an excellent data set for all of Oahu. We're very fortunate to have that. And then looking at where the storm drain inlets are and the sizes of channels. And we put that into an extension of ArcGIS called ArcHydro, and we come up with lines, multicolored lines, that represent where rainfall accumulates based on surface elevation, building footprints, and then the places water is being directed. So the storm drain inlets or the stream channels. And what this does is it really lets us identify and quickly see neighborhood drainage patterns. And it enables us to visualize where water's coming from, where it's going, and how much is accumulating at specific points and from where are the upstream points that are contributing to that drainage. This is a great way to look for opportunities at the neighborhood scale to either address problems or prevent them. And also this coordinates really nicely with the Follow the Drop app and those individual rainwater assessments that Lauren is going to talk about next. So on the next slide, I think, what do these colors mean? The best way to think about, you look at these maps, it's like, what are all the squiggles? Why is there red on my property? The best way to think about these colors is a stoplight. Green lines are the smallest drainage areas. So what we're going to be doing for Wailupe and the other two watersheds is basically we'll have green lines where we've got a very small drainage area, and that's where green infrastructure or rainwater capture is a go. Good places where you've got about the right watershed contributing to a spot that you can do something with green infrastructure on an individual site. Where we see yellow, that means we've got a larger contributing drainage area, and you have to use caution when you're thinking about altering drainage and trying to capture water, because you've got a larger contributing area coming to that point. And where we see red, that's where you need to stop and think, because what you've got in the red lines is essentially some sort of conveyance or location that water is going to flow through based on the elevation and the size of the upstream drainage area. When Sarah and our team and I have done these in other cities, that's often where cities will restrict, for example, building a retaining wall or a fence without engineering review to make sure we don't lead to other flooding or other problems in a neighborhood. So on the next slide, for Maunalua Bay, we're going to be developing flow path mapping for Wailupe, Niu, and Kuli'o watersheds. Once these are done and have been checked very carefully just to make sure we don't have any wonky data, all of you are going to be able to view these for your property and for your neighborhood. And once we get these put together, we really want to hear from you. We'd really like everyone to take a careful look. What do you see on the map that matches your experience, matches the experience on your property? And from there, we can start to coordinate these maps with the work that Maren from Interfleet is going to describe and the individual rainwater assessments to look for possible interventions to alleviate flooding and really address water quality, find some good places to put green infrastructure in a lot of different neighborhoods. So it's very exciting to be able to bring this tool to these watersheds. We've had a lot of great engagement in other communities where we've used this technique. And coupled with the work that JC and Maren and the other members of the team are doing, plus the rainwater assessments, we're going to have a really complete picture of the sort of where and how water's traveling through the watersheds and how we might intervene appropriately to deal with some of those runoff-based problems that Doug was introducing and really make a difference at the right scale. So stay tuned on these. We're really excited to be able to bring this to Mālama Maunalua.
Thanks, JB. Moving on down, Lauren.
Great. Aloha, everyone, and good evening. So I'm Lauren Rothbano. Just a little background about myself. JB keeps talking about green infrastructure, and I'm gonna describe a little bit what that means in the urban areas. JC talked about green infrastructure as it relates to the upper watershed, and I'll talk about how it relates to your own properties and what those things are. But just a background, I've been in the water sector for about 20 years here in Hawaii. I do have a design consultancy firm, but where I'm partnering today is with this new innovative mobile and data platform that we created as a startup locally a few years ago that essentially helps property owners identify their stormwater runoff footprints, but importantly, it optimizes various types of solutions to capture it on property. So I didn't mean to put myself out of business, but essentially it's an engineer and an app, so you don't have to hire someone like me to go help assess your property. But what we are doing and partnering with Doug on is utilizing the app in these communities from Kahala to Hawaii Kai to essentially test the app in the community, but importantly offer these free rainwater assessments, which I'm going to talk about in the next few slides. Go ahead, Doug. Okay. All right. So you heard from JB about the flow path mapping, which is really cool, and it talks about, kind of looks at stormwater at a neighborhood scale. And now as we kind of hone into a single property scale, we can actually utilize the mobile platform to identify your own property's stormwater footprint based on your impervious area. So if you remember what Doug mentioned, impervious area is things like your roof, your driveways, parking lots, if you're a commercial facility. And it'll quantify then how much stormwater runoff you might be generating out of your different downspouts, let's say at a house. So this particular diagram, and I just realized it doesn't have a reference, but this came from the city and county of Honolulu. They have a great guideline, green infrastructure for homeowners. But basically, as you can see in the diagram, on a typical house, when it rains, it's going to fall on your roof, typically come down through your gutter system. And unfortunately, oftentimes those are directed to your driveway and ultimately into a storm drain system. And as Doug mentioned, that could be carrying things off your property, such as fertilizer, some of your dog poop, other contaminants you may not see, like tire treads have arsenic, for example, that, oils might be dripping out of your car. All that stuff is coming off your property and going to the storm drain. So we're all collectively contributing to these pollution issues and flooding. And so what we're doing, again, is if you want to go to rainwaterhawaii.com, you essentially will get myself and or Mālama Maunalua staff to come to your house for a limited time to offer you these free rainwater assessments. And importantly, if you go to the next slide, Doug, what we're trying to do is identify for you, essentially, again, like as if you're getting an engineer coming to your property, identify for you opportunities that you could do to capture on site that stormwater. So that could be simple things like a rain barrel. It could be larger rainwater cisterns. It could be things like rain gardens, which are basically designed gardens they act like a sponge to help kind of store for a brief period that rainwater and get it back into the ground. You may select that you want to replace some of your driveway with things like permeable pavement. That's shown there in the grass pave. Maybe not so much in most cases, but in some areas you can also then retrofit to things like green roofs. And the whole point of this green stormwater infrastructure is to mimic the natural processes of these ecological services. So as we rebuild these green systems back into urban areas, we're essentially creating little pockets of sponges to capture that urban runoff, to treat it, infiltrate it, and help alleviate some of that nuisance flooding as well as pollution in the bay. Go ahead, Doug. So this is just a brief look at the app. We bring in rainfall data. We'll take a photo of, let's say, a drainage device, bring in rainfall data specific to your property. We'll draw the drainage area in the app of, let's say, your roof that's going to that downspout. It'll populate stormwater runoff volumes. And then importantly, it'll optimize various types and sizes of these green infrastructure projects that we can work with you to see what might work for your property. We'll have a little bit of a survey for you to see if you'd actually be interested to get these projects installed, if you would need additional financial incentives. And the goal and hope is that Mālama Maunalua can document these projects around the community. And should there be other opportunities, again, to get projects installed, we have documented projects that they can categorize based on potentially impact or economic needs. Go ahead, Doug. And then even more excitingly, by participating in this limited time offer, you are going to be entered in to win a free rain barrel. So we are going to be raffling off a rain barrel starting this summer. And so I would encourage you to sign up. The odds are pretty good right now, but we are probably going to get busier as summer approaches. And again, you can either take a photo of that QR code, or again, just go to rainwaterhawaii.com and sign up. And we'll be, Kylie, who I see is on the call, or Haley will follow up with you on scheduling. Thanks, Doug.
Thanks, Lauren. And handing off to Interfluve.
Great, thanks, Doug. Aloha, everyone. My name is Maren Hancock with Interfluve, and I'm going to chat with you about a piece of the project that involves the stream. So once stormwater runs off all the properties and the impervious surface, it ends up in these stream channels. And so a piece of the project that we're working on is going to be looking at opportunities in the stream channels themselves to reduce erosion and flooding. And so we're going to be doing stream assessments in Wailupe, Niu, and Kuli'o'o basins. Next slide, please. So while we haven't done the assessments yet, we'll be doing that yet this spring. We, based on our preliminary assessments, we anticipate there might be a couple different types of projects that we might be looking for opportunities to implement. So one example might be concrete removal. These channels are largely concrete lined, which actually can exacerbate flooding and exacerbate erosion. So basically removing concrete and restoring a natural channel, which may look like the image here where there's, this is an image of a hardened rock toe slope with some vegetation on the surface. So we're looking at opportunities to renaturalize the banks as well. And then we're also going to be looking for opportunities to restore creek function. So right now, a lot of sediment gets flushed through these channels very rapidly during rain events and storm events. And we're going to be looking for opportunities to restore sediment transport, which is a natural creek process that could distribute that sediment and process it in a more natural and normal creek function way. So next slide, please. So just to give you a sense of what a typical project like this might look like, this is an example of a project that we just completed. This one is in Milwaukee, in Wisconsin, on the Underwood Creek. And this one is in Milwaukee on the Underwood Creek in Wisconsin. And you can see the before image on the bottom right there. The channel was completely concrete lined. And the purpose of this project was to reduce flooding, reduce erosion, and to reconnect the creek system with the landscape in order to uplift ecology, the ecologic benefit of the site, as well as to promote stream continuity and achieve that creek function that I mentioned in the previous slide. And the image on the left is the post-construction condition. Thanks, Doug. So what we could really use your help with is identifying what spots in your neighborhoods are prone to erosion and flooding. And so we'd be looking for your input and your guidance on specifically where you've seen erosion or flooding occurring, and not specifically just the locations, but also the frequency, severity, and consequence. So for example, if there's a spot that floods every time it rains and causes damage to a certain bank or property, that would be very helpful. Or if there's a site that normally under most rain events is not an issue, but every other year when a bigger event comes through, then it becomes a more catastrophic event locally. We would appreciate any information, any anecdotes, or any information that you have based on your experience in your neighborhood. So that's all I have on the stream assessments. I can hand it back over to Doug.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. So kind of to recap a little bit, Lauren had mentioned that you can sign up for getting the free assessment of your property. You can go to Rainwater Hawaii, I put that in the chat, or you can email runoff@maalamamaunalua.org. And also to help focus the interfluve folks, it's important to know where people are seeing erosion and flooding taking place in the past. So if you know of any place that you've seen flooding or erosion or even just debris in the streets, whatever it may be, please email runoff@maalamamaunalua.org, runoff@maalamamaunalua.org, so that we can kind of focus in a little bit when we start doing those initial assessments. And another way this can really help is it's really important that we have community input on this, not only to help identify where some of these areas of concern might be, but to also, when we start coming up with different ideas, what are ones that the community itself might be supportive of or interested in seeing implemented. So please stay informed, please tell others. CPRmaunalua.com or org is one place where you can get some of this information. Rainwater Hawaii and the Mālama Maunalua website, maalamamaunalua.org, are all places that you can go and learn more about what we're going to be doing and kind of getting updates on everything. That is all we have for the presentation. So we'd like to transition now to answering anyone's questions. I saw that there was one earlier. How does stormwater abatement address slide concerns at those who live on the sides of the valleys? So I don't know if Lauren, you want to answer this, or if this is a better one by one of the other engineering folks.
I was going to first divert it to JB because I think the flow path modeling is going to show whether or not that might be feasible. Obviously, when you get steep slopes, I guess I should back up for a second. So follow the drop is really going to be looking at your building footprints, your impervious area of your own house, driveways, etc. It's not necessarily looking at what's coming down from your neighbor's property or down the mountain. And that's where I think the flow path modeling is being really helpful for you to understand, would there be ways to intercept that stormwater safely? I'll divert to JB from there.
Yeah, as talked about in the chat, one thing we did with the flow path mapping for Bayfield, Wisconsin, which basically goes like this uphill Lake Superior and has some very steep erosion prone ravines where there are slide concerns. We used the flow path map and then extended a buffer on either side of it to create basically a new conservation district where clearing and grading were strictly limited and required pretty intensive review to try to limit the potential for activities and clearing to destabilize those areas. And the flow path was really helpful in seeing how much, which of the ravines were really collecting a lot and where in terms of flow. So it's not a perfect predictor of where stormwater might contribute to slide potential, but it certainly gives a good visual of where and why those drainages are probably forming. It was very helpful in Bayfield in making some policy decisions around that.
Thanks, JB. Andrea, I see you use the hand feature, so go away and ask your question.
Okay, my question had to do, particularly in Guadalupe Valley, but I know this flows into Niu and Kulia'o, and I'm not being funny here. We have steep valley slopes that don't necessarily have obvious ravines for flow. And as I've walked around the valley, I've observed, particularly up House Street, Ahupua'a, some of the others, you can see where people have put in drainage from downspouts or from the backs of their property to direct water off their property, which of course exacerbates flooding in the lower valley. And that's what I'm talking to. What can be done on those properties? How do we address those property owners' concerns to make them part of the overall solution in the valleys?
I would just jump in. I mean, again, I think we'll see a lot based either on being at the properties themselves during these rainwater assessments to identify if certain practices might be feasible. And then working with the flow path modeling, we can see which of these properties and which solutions they can come up with. For example, even if they were, for example, to put up some form of a rainwater harvesting system, at least that's going to store some volume of that storm. Again, as long as they have it relatively empty before rain events, that they can be prepared for that storage, they can help then mitigate some of the issues. Now, for those big storms that we had in December and otherwise, that's a different situation because, a lot of these green infrastructure practices are really designed for storms that happen about 90% of the time. We're not talking about the big whammers. So we still need to be cognizant on how to safely get the water out when those big storms come.
But this has to do with the way the water flows in the valley, and particularly with the development of in Guadalupe and Niu, the development of the ridges. You now have more water flowing down the sides of the ridges, even in our usual rainfall. And so part of the problem is what falls on the roofs, but part of it is what's coming onto the properties from the overflow onto the ridges. And, I think that these residents would be concerned and willing to help, but they're primary concern is their individual properties. How do we get them to see the overall picture and find a solution that helps them and the overall community?
Yeah, Andrea, that's a really important point, and it's sadly very common in communities where we work. We had another community we did the flow path mapping in, and there was some suspicion like, well, why is this area wet all the time? It shouldn't be based on the flow path. Well, it was foundation drains. People had illegally directed foundation drains in a couple of communities to other people's property. Once we get the mapping done, it'd be great to take a look at areas where you see that, and let's see what the elevation mapping shows, and then maybe we can start to pinpoint some of the problems. And that may be an area for, like Lauren said, some small scale interventions or some education, trying to find a cooperative solution. So those are great areas to keep in mind once we get these maps. Let's see what the elevation shows should be happening, and then if we're finding foundation drains or altered drainage and such, it may be a city code issue, it may just be a neighbor education issue.
And that said too, Andrea, just on the bigger picture, and Doug, maybe you can correct me if I need to bite my tongue, but I believe we have a swim model which looks at kind of the big picture, which looks at yeah, like what is the contribution from these, you know, upper watersheds in terms of stormwater volumes, and down to, you know, impervious areas. And it takes a big picture view. And then the idea was then let's look at then as a neighborhood scale through the individual parcel to come up with solutions. So we're trying to actually hopefully come up with that story, I think is one of our goals, if correct me if I'm wrong, Doug, to be able to kind of see the different pieces and how it all comes together. And then hopefully how you as, or not you, but individual property owners, whether that be commercial or residential or whatever, can see the different solutions that they can do to hopefully make a collective impact, positive impact.
Does that address what you were thinking, Andrea?
It might.
We can follow up and talk offline.
Yeah, it's complex, but it affects all of these valleys, because the traditional view is you look from Alpha to Mackay, but when you get in the valleys, it's not that simple. It's looking from the tops of the ridges down, and it includes the ridges closer to the ocean. Because I can remember since we moved back in 2010, watching water falling off the ridges of Guadalupe Valley, which I had never seen when I was growing up, when the tops of the ridges were not developed. So that's something new. And there's been flooding in the valley related to the development of the top of the ridges. So that's an issue. It's not just the people in the valleys who need to do something, it's people on top of the ridges. How do we address that? How do we engage everyone, get everyone to understand we are all part of the solution, and it's not hard.
No, and I think that's a big part of what we're hoping to do with this is to really engage the community. Liz, I see your hand, sorry.
Hi, can you guys hear me? I'm sorry, I came in late. I meant to come in on time. I came in late, so I apologize for that. But can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you great.
Okay, so I live on in Ahupua'a, and I've been here for 5 years. I've been in Hawaii for, oh God, over 40 years. So I'm familiar with Hawaii. And we took our land and we pulled out halekoa and California grass and planted native species. And I'm not gonna say it's easy, but it's been a challenge. And so when we talk about how to keep our water from our keep it from going down, I just wanted to input that. That's to make it sustainable and bring it back to what it used to be, and we're going to be a lot better off So I would encourage people to look at what do you have in your landscape, and you don't want concrete. I guess I missed probably a lot of good stuff and smart stuff, and again, I apologize for that. But yeah, if you can just plant native plants, and I think that's going to help.
That's great. Yeah, I am sure JC perked up a little bit. He is doing native plant reforestation up in the upper watersheds and actually throughout Oahu. But for the purposes of this, he's going to be looking at doing that up there. And that is something I know with some of the rain garden stuff that Lauren's spoken of. And
Right.
Mālama Maunalua as well has done, plant a tree, save the seed initiatives to try and get people
Sure.
to
Sure.
put in.
All the concrete we're putting in and all the rock work, and that is not helping. Just if you can get back to the native plants, and if anybody wants to contact me later, because I do know a lot about it, but I believe that's a good start for a lot of people.
Great. Thank you very much.
Aloha.
Any other questions or comments that folks have? Now's your time while everyone is on the call. I am not seeing any.
I know.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you everyone for taking time out on your Tuesday. If you found this thoroughly exciting, we will be posting it to social media and other places so you can continue to watch it throughout the week and weekend. But please let people know that this effort is taking place. We need to get as much input and guidance as we can for the rest of the community to help us really nail this problem and really address it for a comprehensive way that can actually be one that we don't have to keep coming back to it every few years when we have another flood. So mahalo to our speakers. I know some of them are calling from areas that are much later than it is here in Hawaii. So mahalo, and yeah, enjoy your evenings. If you have any questions, you can email at runoff@lamamaunalua.org. Thanks.